this morning. Those lights are quite bright, aren't they, this morning? I feel very under the spotlight. No, it's fine. I wasn't complaining. Quite like being in the spotlight. So we're back in our series in Mark, and Dave kicked off the new year last week with talking about God's provision. And we've had that wonderful passage read to us by Pam. Thank you, Pam. Beautifully read, off the cuff like that. Brilliant. And this morning, our subject is learning from fear, or learning about and from fear. I wish I could tell you that when you give your life to God, it's clear sailing. I wish I could tell you that following Jesus means an easy life, an easy road. But I can't, because that's not true. But what I can tell you is that life is tough for everyone. And sometimes it feels like life is almost tougher for a Christian, because it feels like God asks us to do tricky things, doesn't he? But if you're a follower of Jesus, we need to know that we are going to face tricky times, difficult times. I'm not someone that believes in prosperity and health for Christians. I don't believe that to be biblical or accurate. But what I do know is that Jesus says to us in John 16:33, that in this world we will have trouble, but take heart, because I have overcome the world. So let's have a look at this passage, because we're looking at this incredible miracle of Jesus walking on the water and thinking about fear and difficult times. And as we look at it, I want us to hold on to three nevers. I want us to remember we are never out of God's sight. We are never out of God's reach, and we are never out of God's care. And I hope that we can see that in tough times and in good times as well, that these three nevers are true. Our reading started with verse 45, when Jesus sends his disciples out onto the boat to sail across the Sea of Galilee. And then he dismissed the crowd. And we have clarification of what has happened exactly before this verse. We actually have clarification of it. At the end of our reading, they had just witnessed the feeding of the 5,000, which of course is what Dave spoke to us about last week. So it's in this context. Jesus dismisses the crowd, sends the disciples on a boat, having just witnessed this incredible miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. So let's have a look at being never out of God's sight. The disciples, we realize pretty soon into our reading, are in a really tough spot. They're in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and they're fighting this strong headwind and not making any headway. It's interesting as well when we remember that it was Jesus that sent them on the boat. He sent them across the Sea of Galilee. And I think sometimes we need to remember that when we're in a tough situation, and I'm not suggesting that God puts us in situations like this all the time, but sometimes when we're in that situation, we're right where God wants us to be. We are exactly where he wants us to be. So he sends the disciples in the boat across the Sea of Galilee, and he goes up into the mountain to pray. And this is the voice version of the Bible that I've picked this from. So after everyone had gone, he slipped away to pray on the mountainside overlooking the sea. And when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land, and he saw the disciples were making little progress because they were rowing against a stiff wind. So the disciples are stuck in the middle of the lake, fighting the winds. Jesus is up on the mountainside praying, but he's overlooking the sea. Of course he is. Of course he's overlooking the sea. Of course he chose a place to pray where he could still see them. He's looking down on the Sea of Galilee. He saw them in their predicament. And actually, I think this is the first of three miracles we have in this passage. The Sea of Galilee is about 4 miles across. So the disciples were about halfway, about 2 miles across the Sea of Galilee. Now, maybe on a clear day, from an elevated position, you might possibly be able to make out a small boat in the middle of the lake, 2 miles away. I doubt you'd be able to identify the occupants, but you might be able to spot it. But at night, with the wind whipping and the water and the waves, there's a miracle here. There's a miracle of seeing. I found a picture of the Sea of Galilee at night, and that's with lights today. And this is the Sea of Galilee in the day. How did he see them? It's the first of 3 miracles, I think. Now, some of these disciples that are on this boat, they're experienced, hardy fishermen. They've spent their lives on this lake. They know what it's like when the wind whips up and the waves grow, and yet they're frightened and they're straining to control this boat. All of us have times when we're fearful and worried and frightened and concerned. And whether you feel like you're a hardy, strong Christian this morning, like some of those disciples were hardy, strong fishermen, we still go through those times. Now, whether this was a miracle of seeing or not, we need to remember we actually are never out of God's sight. You may feel this morning that you're stuck in the middle of a huge lake, going nowhere, far away from God's watchful eye. But that's not true. That's not the case. God sees us through it all. He sees our situation. He knows what we're going through. And so whether you're in a tough spot this morning or not, we all need to remember we are never out of God's sight. He is always positioned so he can see us. Whether it's dark, despite the distance, he can still see us. The other never we have is we are never out of God's reach. We're never out of God's reach. Look at the start of verse 48. Before daylight, he came near them walking on the water. Jesus was on land. The disciples were in the middle of the lake, and it would seem they were completely out of Jesus' reach. But Jesus suddenly comes walking right up to them. This is the big miracle, if you like, of this story, Jesus walking on the water. And skeptics will tell you things like, oh, actually what the disciples did was they saw Jesus walking in the shallows. You know, they couldn't quite make him out. He was walking in the shallows. But that doesn't explain how he walks right up to the boat and how later on we read that he speaks to them. This is a true miracle. Jesus walking on top of the water, demonstrating his power over nature and his own true nature as God. In the Old Testament, in the book of Job, we have this verse. He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. And so by this miracle, Jesus is showing us he is God. He is truly God. And as verse 48 continues, he came near them, walking on the water, and would have passed them by, and some of them saw him walking on the water, and thought he was a ghost, and cried out. When they all saw him, they were terrified. So here they are, stuck in the middle of a lake, and Jesus comes walking up to them. But they don't recognize him. They can't comprehend how can a human being walk on water, until they assume he must be a ghost. Jesus was about to pass by them, and they almost miss him. You know, we're never out of God's reach. Miles away they were from Jesus. He was on land. They were in the middle of the lake. But sometimes we don't recognize it when God comes to rescue us. And we need to be aware of that. They didn't recognize him. He'd come to rescue them. And their first thoughts were that he was a ghost and it wasn't real. I'm sure you've heard this story before, but I'm going to tell you it again. It's that story of there's a flood, big flood, and a Christian man climbs up onto the roof of his house to wait for God to save him. And his neighbors throw him a rope and say, grab onto the rope, we'll pull you over. And he says, it's okay, God's going to save me. And then a boat comes by and they say, jump in, jump in. And he says, don't worry, God's going to save me. And the water's coming up and up and up. And then a helicopter is above him and they let down a ladder and they say, jump on, climb on the ladder. And he says, no, it's okay. God's going to save me. And he dies and he gets to heaven and he says to God, God, why didn't you save me? And God says, I sent your neighbors, I sent a boat, I sent a helicopter. I mean, come on, what more did you want from me? And I think sometimes God's rescue can be unexpected, that in itself it can seem frightening because we don't understand it. God can be right there ready to help us and we don't recognize. We need to be ready to respond. This is Psalm 139 is a wonderful psalm of reassurance for us. Can I go anywhere apart from your spirit? Is there anywhere I can go to escape your watchful presence? If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in the realm of the dead, you are there. If I ride on the wings of morning, if I make my home in the most isolated part of the ocean, even then you will be there to guide me. Your right hand will embrace me. For you are always there. Even if I'm afraid and think to myself, there is no doubt that the darkness will swallow me. The light around me will soon be turning to night. You see in the dark, for it is not dark to your eyes. For you, the night is just as bright as the day. Darkness and light are the same to your eyes. You know, we might feel like we're stuck in the middle of this sea, going nowhere, far away from help or rescue. We might feel like that today. God is always there. We are never out of God's reach. We are also never out of God's care. We're never out of God's sight. We're never out of God's reach. And we are never out of God's care. This is verse 51, again from the Voice version of the Bible. So Jesus immediately calling out, don't be frightened. Do you see it is I? And he walked across the water to the boat. And as soon as he stepped aboard, the contrary wind ceased its blowing, and they were greatly astonished. Although they just witnessed the miracle of Jesus feeding 5,000 with bread and fish, and other signs beside, they didn't understand what it meant, and in their hearts they remained hard. We're never out of God's care. It's easy to believe sometimes, perhaps, that God has forgotten us, or abandoned us, or God just doesn't care. And nothing could be further from the truth. God cares for us in the midst of the storm when we're frightened and fearful. We need to trust his purposes, even when we don't understand them. I don't know why Jesus let the disciples battle the wind all night long. Mark tells us he saw them struggling in the early evening, but he didn't actually go out to them until nearly dawn. In some versions of the Bible, it's referred to as the fourth watch of the night. You see, the Romans divided the night into four. The fourth watch was 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. It was the last before dawn. So the disciples have been pretty much at it all night, straining against the wind, straining at the oars. And I don't know why Jesus lets us go through difficult times sometimes, fearful times. But I do know that God will use those times to teach us and to train us and to develop our faith and our character. And we have this terrible tendency to push God away when we need him the most and turn to other things first. Can you imagine if the disciples had done that with Jesus? That Jesus is standing there on the water and the disciples are saying, why are we out here in the middle of the lake going nowhere? Why did you send us out here? Now you expect us to let you in the boat? I mean, none of that would make sense for them to say that, but we do say that in our actions and in the way that we manage our situations sometimes. And we need to trust God's purposes, even when we don't understand them. We need to trust that God cares for us even when life hurts. Don't let Jesus pass you by, but welcome him into the boat with you. Don't push God away when you need him the most. Jesus climbed into the boat with the disciples, and then another miracle happened. The winds died down and everything was calm again. Mark tells us that they were greatly astonished that happened, even though they just witnessed the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. I don't know about you, but I want Jesus in the boat with me. The disciples needed to grow in their faith. Jesus had just fed a crowd of 5,000 plus with a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. They'd been there. In fact, they were part of it. It's the first miracle, really. The disciples are actually part of it. It wasn't done in front of them. They didn't just witness it. They were actually part of it. They handed out the bread and the loaves. They collected up the baskets afterwards. They'd been part of this incredible miracle, and you think that would have given them confidence for the situation they were in then. And of course, just 2 chapters earlier, I know they wouldn't refer to it as 2 chapters earlier, Jesus had calmed the storm. Mark 4, we read the story of the calming of the storm. And he's done it again. By just stepping into the boat, the storm that they were currently in was calmed. But they still did not fully understand who Jesus was. And these things continue to astonish them. I found this commentary. I'm going to read this commentary to you. How can the disciples still be in doubt about Jesus after having been part of so many miracles? Like the Israelites in the Old Testament, the disciples are discovering the truth that miracles don't produce faith. As Jesus so often points out, the process works the other way round. It's faith that produces miracles. Miracles are only signs, evidence of truth that you have to know before the miracle. As long as the disciples are still in doubt about who Jesus is, they find their faith constantly challenged and frequently wavering. It will not be until after the resurrection, the greatest miracle of all, that they will come to recognize and believe in Jesus for who he is, and then their hearts will at last be open. It's interesting, isn't it? Faith produces miracles, not the other way around. Because the incredible thing is that when we arrive on the other side, do you often wonder as well, just the providence of God in this? How was Jesus had this in his mind all the time? Because how was he going to get to the other side of the lake? You know, he sent them off in the boat and said, I'll dismiss the crowd. And I love the providence of God in this, how God already knew, Jesus already knew what was going on here, how he was going to use this. And he's thinking, it's okay, I've just got to walk halfway across the lake and then I'll be in the boat with the guys to the other side. Isn't that amazing? How some of these things are just slipped into the Bible, and then when you think about it, you think, wow, Jesus knew he was going to walk 2 miles across the lake and then go 2 miles with the lads to the other side. But when they get to land, we are told that the people recognize Jesus immediately. They bring their sick to him. In fact, it's quite gushy. They rush all over the place, finding sick people to bring to Jesus. Even the hem of his clothes, they know, will heal them. What a contrast between the disciples and the people. The disciples thought Jesus was a ghost and almost let him pass them by. And the people recognized Jesus immediately, as soon as he comes ashore. The disciples are amazed at Jesus' power because they don't understand. The people believe Jesus can help them, immediately believe he can help them. They go running to find every sick person they can find, knowing that even the edge of his cloak will heal them. What an amazing contrast. For us this morning, do we recognize who Jesus is this morning? Who this man is this morning, who this God is this morning, because the message is clear. We are never out of God's sight. He is always positioned so he can see what is going on in our lives. We are never out of God's reach. We could never be too far away for him not to get to us, to rescue us. And we are never out of his care. And perhaps some of us this morning are going through difficult times. Perhaps you feel you are in the middle of a lake, straining at the oar and getting nowhere. God has not forgotten you. He has not abandoned you. And we need to remember that. If we're never out of God's sight, that means he can never forget us. If we're never out of God's reach, that means he's never abandoned us. If we're never out of God's care, it's because he loves us so much. He sent Jesus to die for us. He is the all-knowing, all-present, all-powerful, all-loving God who knows your troubles, knows when we are fearful, knows what we're going through, and will rescue us in his perfect time. And you know, for some of us, that might be the first watch of the night. For some of us, it might be the fourth watch of the night. But we need to make sure that we don't push him away. We need to invite him into the boat of our life. Trust him, believe him, and invite him into the boat of our life. Because incredible things happen when we do that. And we can have this assurance of his presence with us, knowing his love and his care. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to sing, and then we're going to move into a time of communion as we think about this. Think about what Jesus did for us at the cross. So let's just pray, shall we? Lord God, we thank you for this incredibly powerful passage where we see these miracles. The miracle that you could see the disciples where they were. I thank you that you see us wherever we are this morning. Thank you for the miracle of you walking on the water out to rescue them. Thank you that that's what you do for us. You want to walk out to us and rescue us from our situations this morning, to be with us through whatever we're going through. And Lord, thank you that as you stepped into the boat, that the storm was calmed. And I pray that this morning we would invite you into the boat of our lives so that we know we are never out of your sight, never out of your reach, and never out